Hey guys, it's Ashley Francis with Blue Sage Counseling and Wellness, and today's video is on boundaries. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about because it inevitably comes up all of the time. So when we talk about boundaries, specifically healthy boundaries, this is by far one of the biggest things that causes conflict in relationships. But more importantly, I think it causes a lot of confusion as well, because a lot of people don't understand what are good boundaries, what are healthy boundaries, what are bad boundaries, how do I know when a boundary is being crossed? Or a lot of people have an idea or an understanding that the boundary is either not good or has been violated, but they don't know how to fix it. And in reality, it can be a pretty dicey, complicated process. But what I want to do today is kind of clear up some of those misconceptions and also help to give you some tactical, practical tools to start practicing right now, right away, so that you can start feeling better and at the very least, start to devise some insight into your own boundary patterns and perhaps engage in some deeper work to try and change them. So let's dive in. First, we are going to talk about what are boundaries. And specifically, what we're talking about are emotional boundaries, because we've got physical boundaries that pertain to our body, but today the discussion is really more on emotional boundaries. Here are some simple definitions. One is emotional boundaries are a set, clear line between what is me and what is you. What are my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors? What are your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors? It's your own invisible force field that's around you, and it's your responsibility to protect it, not anybody else's. It is your responsibility. And it is our way of determining our own thoughts, feelings, and needs, as opposed to our thoughts, feelings, and needs being determined by someone or something else. It is our responsibility, and it is it's how we determine what our thoughts, feelings, and needs are for ourselves. It's also what we are willing to accept from others and what we are not willing to accept from others. Oftentimes when we start with boundary work, clients are hesitant to engage in these types of interventions and exercises because they feel like it's unkind. They feel like it's selfish, and it takes some time to start to understand that no, it is not selfish. It's actually a form of love, specifically self-love, when we're able to put ourselves first, when we're able to assert ourselves. And it's actually our responsibility to teach other people how to treat us. There's a misconception, and I'm so guilty of this too, that we make this assumption that other people already know what our boundaries are, the ways that we prefer to be treated, because it's so simple, right? It's so easy and obvious to us. Why don't other people also feel that way too? Or how do they not already have this understanding? It's actually our responsibility to be able to teach people what our preferences are. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. It is who I am, what I'm responsible for, but it's also what I'm not responsible for. So what are the things that you are responsible for? You're responsible for your happiness, your behaviors, your choices, and your feelings. I'm gonna say that again. You're responsible for your happiness, your behavior, your choices, and your feelings. What are you not responsible for? Other people's happiness, other people's behavior, other people's choices, and other people's feelings. Now, this one particularly tends to get really dicey when it comes to parents and their children. Being able to establish some healthy boundaries between parent and child oftentimes can be challenging because there's different stages of life. Perhaps the parent has not also grown as the child has grown, so they're still taking on some of those former responsibilities that were perhaps necessary when the child was younger, but they're no longer necessary because they've gotten older and it is expected that they need to start taking some responsibility for themselves. So this is a really difficult one for parents sometimes. Okay, so now let's talk about the different types of emotional boundaries. So keep in mind that in the world of psychology, there are several different models of different types of boundaries, but we're just going to talk about one today to keep it simple. And the one we're going to talk about are the big three, which are loose, rigid, and flexible. And I think sometimes rigid is also called diffuse. So if you're doing some research on your own, it may show up that way. Let's define first that both loose and rigid are, I think I had that the other way around. Maybe loose is diffuse. Either way, for the sake of today, loose, rigid, and flexible is what we're going to be talking about. Loose and rigid are the unhealthy types of boundary patterns, and flexible is the healthy type. Now, keep in mind before we get into this discussion that just because you may have loose boundaries in one area and flexible in the other doesn't mean that you're an unhealthy person, okay? So these types of things they're patterns, but they do not determine who you are as a whole. And try to just keep an open listening ear to be curious. If you start to feel bad about some of these things that are really resonating with you, try to reframe it as, oh, thank goodness. This is what a gift that I'm able to uncover that this is an area that perhaps was a blind spot to me, and now it's not. So I can actually do something with it now. If we don't have awareness, then we can't change behavior. Try to go at a slow, even pace and just be curious as we go through this. All right, so loose boundaries. This is typically characterized by a person feeling as though they are inferior. They feel like they don't have anything to contribute. This is the type of person that when they're in a meeting, they may have the answer to the question that's being asked, but they rarely speak up. They feel like their opinion is not valid, it's not worth it. They just don't feel like they belong. And if you are of school age, this can also show up in hesitating to raise your hand. You may have the answer, or you may think you have the answer, but you certainly don't want to risk raising your hand and embarrassing yourself. Loose boundaries also look like being a yes person. This is the type of person that says yes even though they don't want to. They have a tendency to overextend themselves, go above and beyond for friends and family, but they really don't want to say yes to what's being requested of them. The next is that they also look to others to know how to think, feel, and act. This is not to say that this person doesn't know what to think or how to act at all or at any time. It just rather means that they have a tendency to defer to other people and other things when it comes to the final say. So they may have a gut feeling, but they've had to pull 6 other friends or family members or coworkers to try and figure out how should I feel about this? And they wind up getting even more confused than they did in the beginning. It can be a vicious cycle. The loose pattern more has to do with just not knowing themselves very well and not trusting their judgment. Next is rigid. So these types of people, they want control. They enjoy it. They feel safe there. They have a sense of authority. They may have a position of authority as well. They are very black and white people. They have a really hard time seeing gray. Sometimes they don't like the gray. They tend to be kind of resistant towards the gray. They have a tendency to be perfectionists. And it doesn't necessarily mean that a perfectionist always equates with rigid boundaries, but there are aspects that overlap. So keep that in mind. They're scared to make mistakes. They don't want to embarrass themselves. They don't want to be viewed as incompetent. They oftentimes tend to control the meeting, or they control others' actions, or have the desire to control others' actions. And they just have a sense of superiority. And lastly, the flexible boundaries. So these people like to share contribution and control. They have a very good sense of where they have authority and where they have competence, but they also have a pretty good sense of where they lack competence. Not every single person knows every single thing. They will often defer and delegate to others who have more expertise in that area, and they're not afraid to do that. They're also not afraid to ask for help if they need it. They put their ego aside, and they tend to be easily guidable, they're coachable. Doesn't mean that they necessarily like what's been said at first glance, but they will receive the information, take it in, and make the necessary changes. But they also like to take risks, and they also know when to say no. They understand that being in their comfort zone is not good, and they need to be able to push themselves forward, but they also have a pretty good sense of when something doesn't fit for them, and they don't have a problem being able to verbalize that. One more thing about that is your boundaries will differ depending on the relationship, but they don't differ that much as a whole. So what I mean by that is we have different relationships with our romantic partners, with our friends, with our employer, our employees, our coworkers, just a variety of different relationships in our life. And even though we might have loose boundaries in one relationship doesn't mean that we'll have loose relationships across the board. But what we do notice is that if you've got a pattern of a certain type of boundary, then it has a tendency to show up more, I don't want to say more often, but you will see it in other places. So for instance, if you have loose boundaries with friends and family, you might have loose boundaries in your romantic relationships too. But this does not necessarily mean that that is the case. I've oftentimes seen that there are certain people that have maybe rigid boundaries at work, but they actually have loose boundaries in their personal lives. So that's not uncommon too. It's not always a one size fits all, but it's not surprising to see that that pattern can be consistent across other relationships too. Okay, so now let's talk about the rescuer-victim dynamic. So this is equivalent to the narcissist codependent dynamic. It's a corollary to that. I also did another video on the narcissist codependent, so this is more of an extension of that conversation as well. So let's talk about what that is. People with poor boundaries, they typically fall into one of two categories. First category is those who take too much responsibility for the emotions and actions of others. This is known as the rescuer. And then those who expect others to take too much responsibility for their own emotions and actions. This is the victim. So let's talk more specifically about what that is. People who blame others for their emotions and actions, the victim, they do so because they believe that if they put the responsibility to those around them, that they'll actually receive the love that they've always wanted and needed. This is incorrect, but this is a faulty way of thinking. If they constantly paint themselves as a victim, eventually someone will come to save them. This is why this type of person constantly attracts the same type of partner over and over again, because they fit like a glove. If they are a victim and the rescuer is their complement, if they are paired with another victim, they're going to repel like oil and water. It just doesn't work. But the victim and the rescuer, as soon as they come together, it's stars and stripes and fireworks. That's the word I'm looking for. It just comes together. It's that instant chemistry, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. The victim in this case is more synonymous with the narcissist. Now, at first, this might sound a little counterintuitive. What do you mean a narcissist is a victim? They never play the victim. What I mean by that is that they always blame other people for their problems. So if it's never their fault, then they're always the victim. So that is what the narcissist, aka the victim, that's what they are. That's the same person. All right, so people who take the blame for other people's emotions and actions, the doormat, are always looking to save someone. They have the proverbial savior complex. They're always wanting to fix people and fix things. They believe that they can fix their partner, and then they will receive the love and appreciation that they've always wanted. So this is the type of person that takes on the emotions of not only themselves, but their partner, but oftentimes other people around them too. These people also tend to be the people pleasers, empaths, the sensitive people. They have a tendency to fall into this category. It doesn't always mean that they're one and the same, but oftentimes they do. The codependent and the rescuer are also synonymous in this case too. So for me, I'm a recovering codependent rescuer, and it's really important to know, this is really, really important, that no matter how much work you do on yourself, during times of stress, you will go back to your default boundary pattern. It's just fact. You have been wired a certain way. It is nature and nurture. It's okay. It's okay. So the first step is just to be able to accept the fact that you're wired this way, but this also goes for the victim narcissist as well. Then just being able to recognize that there are things that we can do to change. We can make things better. We can move the dial a little bit. But just go easy on yourself when the going gets rough. Some of these old habits might come back, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll stay there. You may practice some old habits, but you're not going to do it for very long because you know, oh yeah, I've been here before. I know this feeling and I'm not going down that road again. When we talk about recovery, that's what recovery looks like. It doesn't mean that you're not going to fall back into the habit. It just means that you catch it quicker and you can pivot faster as well. And then the other thing to note about the rescuer victim dynamic is that it's essentially at the heart of it, it's not your fault. It's not your fault that you're in the victim role or the rescuer role. Largely, our emotional boundary patterns are set by the models that we had before us. In other words, whichever parent you identified with the most, whatever their emotional boundary pattern is, you're likely to have adopted that too. And much of that has happened on the subconscious level. You may not even know that you did it or doing it, and you may not even realize that it's shown up until adulthood. So if that's the case, we really need to go easy on ourselves and understand that it's really not your fault where this came from, but rather there again, it's all about awareness. And now that you are aware of it, you can do something about it. And furthermore, we are all just trying to be loved. We just want to feel a sense of belonging, and we just want to feel that sense of love. It's a Darwinian imperative. It's just it's inherent to being a human being. And when we have this type of pattern, we're just doing the best that we can in order to get love and approval. And it just means that you have been repeating the same patterns to be able to get it. And even though it's been faulty, it's all you know how to do. That's why people repeat the same mistakes. They keep choosing the same partners. It's really to get to a place where you got to hit this rock bottom of hurting enough to wake you up to the fact that, okay, you know what? I really need to start doing some things differently. But it's not your fault, and you come by it honest, and there's always room for improvement. Finally, let's talk about what are some of the things that you can start doing now to start turning this pattern around, no matter if you identify with rigid or loose or the victim or the rescuer. Doesn't matter. These are all things that you can start doing right away. Just to reiterate, once again, awareness is key. That's always step one. Become aware of your patterns. And one of the best ways to do this is obviously therapy, because a therapist is a professional who's trained in being able to help you uncover your blind spots. But you don't have to start there. Sometimes going to therapy is really daunting. So you can read some self-help books. You could do YouTube, Audible. You can talk to your friends and family if you feel like they're a good source. Sometimes they're not. So be a good judge there. But the idea is just to start paying attention. Just pay attention to your behaviors throughout the day. Notice where you are people pleasing, or try to notice when you are behaving like a know-it-all. Start to notice that stuff and then establish a dialogue around it with whomever you trust and choose. The next step would be to communicate your thoughts to others. In particular, this would be when to say yes and when to say no. And your intuition is your best guide on this. And to be able to give yourself permission to say no when it doesn't feel good, and yes when it does. Now keep in mind, of course, there are exceptions to this. Of course, there are things throughout our day that may not feel good to us, meaning that we have to do it, and we have to do it anyway. But by and large, that's not the case for as many things as we think. We don't have to do everything that we don't feel like doing, particularly requests from maybe friends or family. And it's okay. I'm telling you right now, it is okay to tell a family member or a friend, no, I respectfully decline your offer, and you don't have to give any details. It's okay to start doing that now. You do not owe anybody anything. The next thing is to know when to give an apology versus taking responsibility. This is a really big one. It resonates with me a lot. As part of being a recovering codependent, I used to apologize a lot. I don't do it anymore because I now recognize the importance and the difference between when is it appropriate to take responsibility and when is it appropriate to apologize. So we apologize if we have actually done wrong or brought some harm to someone, especially if you did it intentionally. Be honest with yourself. We all do that kind of stuff from time to time. So if you brought harm to someone else, then yeah, there's need for an apology. But more often than not, you could actually wind up taking responsibility more often than having to give an apology. So if you made a mistake, that's a time to take responsibility. If you've caused an inconvenience for someone, that's a time to apologize. But if you just made a human error, it wasn't your fault, oops, I take responsibility. It was an oversight. Maybe there was something that I didn't know that I now know, and I want to be able to communicate that to my partner or to my employer. Now I can come forward and say, you know what? I take responsibility for not being prepared enough or having said that the wrong way. I'll prepare better next time. The next one is delegate tasks. Ooh, that's a big one and a hard one. So here's the beauty of delegating tasks, and this is why you should do it. When you delegate tasks, you are then opening up the space for you to concentrate your attention on the things that fill your cup and make you happy. That's the biggest reason why we delegate. It's hard to do that, especially for the rigid victim types of people, because they do want to have that control. They don't necessarily trust other people to do it as well as they can. That's oftentimes a lie that we're telling ourselves. It's not always the case that the other people can't do it as well as we can. Oftentimes that's not true. If you could just get things off of your plate, I want you to focus on all of the things that will open up for you when you're able to get some things off of your plate. That's what it's all about, and how it makes you feel. When you have too much on your plate, and especially doing too much for other people, it starts to bring on resentment and anger. And over time, that stuff can get explosive. So the next is to protect your time. Don't overcommit. This one kind of goes back to just knowing yourself and seeing your time as an asset. It's a value of yours, and that most other people are not deserving of your personal time. That you've got work time and you've got personal time, and there is no in between. And it is okay to say, I'm shutting it down and this is me time because I value myself and I know that I need this time to re-energize myself. If I don't take this time to re-energize and recalibrate, I'm not going to be good for anybody the next day. It's actually in my best interest, as well as everyone around me, for me to re-energize, and not to mention it helps to also keep me in the long game, because this is one of the things that leads to burnout the most, is just overcommitting and overdoing, building that resentment, building that anger, and before you know it, we are completely burned out. So that's another way to be protective of your time. The next is to ask for space. This is a big one, especially for mothers. A good example is when you come home after work in that transition from work to home life. A lot of mothers are just bombarded by their partner or by their children as soon as they walk in the door. I'm telling you today, right here, right now, it is okay for you to ask or even tell your family that I am going to take 10 to 15 minutes as soon as I walk in the door for myself. I'm going to go to my bedroom, I'm going to shut the door, I'm going to be by myself, and I don't want to be bothered. That's okay to do that. You need that time to transition. So that's a good example. Speaking up if you feel uncomfortable with how someone's treating you, or if your needs are being infringed upon. Here's a really, really hard one for the loose boundary people, the rescuers. They feel like it's rude. They feel like they don't want to hurt other people's feelings. They don't want to risk someone else getting angry with them. Well, that's understandable. What I want you to focus on is pivoting your attention to the benefits of being able to do that. Because we oftentimes get sucked in to over focusing on the other person's reaction. They might get upset. They might have something in resistance to say to you. But what you want to do is focus on what is it freeing you up to do? When I feel uncomfortable and I speak up for myself, it makes me feel good about me. I stand up straighter. That gives me a sense of self-confidence and self-esteem. And there again, when my cup is full and I'm feeling re-energized, I'm doing things for myself, then I can do good for those around me as well. The next is dropping the guilt and responsibility for others. That's a long one. That's a process rather. There again, it just comes back to the division of what is mine and what is yours. If I am perfectly clear on what I am responsible for and what you are responsible for, it leaves very little room for guilt. You might feel a twinge of it. We're emotional beings. It's not to say that once you've set a boundary that you won't feel guilt. That might happen, but really it's about observing that division between you and the other person and understanding that there's nothing to feel guilty about in the long run. So that's why we might feel the guilt, but we need to drop it. And I'm a better mother, I'm a better father, I'm a better daughter, better son, better partner when I'm able to do these things. Stay focused on the long game. Here's the last one, and this one is also has more to do with the loose boundary rescuer type of person, where you share personal information gradually and in a mutual way. Sometimes the rescuer, the loose boundary person, has a tendency to overshare. And that can, at least in relationships, I can say I've been guilty of this. It can create what I call artificial intimacy. You're oversharing, which can make you feel, maybe the other person's oversharing too, which can make you feel closer to that person prematurely before you even know them. And this can be the same with friendships too.